Good evening, everybody. I'm Bob Kelly. I think I've seen you all before. We've been doing this together for a long time. Welcome tonight. The talks are put on by the Victor Historic Advisory Committee. It's a town committee. We advise Babette Huber, who's the town historian, and actually she tells us what we should be doing, and then we advise her. Works out really well. It's wonderful to be back doing these talks. It's great to have you all here. We've got one more talk in this year in December, and Wilma Townsend will be talking on the history of textiles in Ontario County. And this is based on a program that's out of the County Historic Society.
It's based on the
exhibit there. We are pretty well scheduled for, we're going to take the winter off, start up again in April. Frank Tischer, who's done one talk, is going to do a talk on just growing up in Victor. It's always interesting to hear Frank talk and give his remembrances of what life was like in Victor when we were just a little farming community. In probably June now, we're thinking, Babette will be doing a talk on barns in Victor, and she's doing that in conjunction with a survey of barns and trying to keep track of what barns we have. As you know, barns are sort of an institution that's going away. A lot of the barns are falling down and in disrepair, but there are a lot of great historic barns in Victor, and this will be an opportunity to talk about them. And probably that'll be in June in conjunction with that program. And also in June, we are working on the Land of Legends, stock car racing at Canandaigua, and particularly Tom Ewing, who's from Victor. He lived just down the street from me and had a crew working on a stock car for years and years, and is on the Wall of Fame for Canandaigua, and we'll be talking about Tom, his crew, and stock car racing back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So we got a great program coming up for the year. Tonight we're really fortunate to have Cynthia Howk back again with us. If you remember or were fortunate enough to be there, Cynthia did a talk on Eileen Malone and the harp, on being a harpist, and she's probably one of the most renowned harpists in the world. It was a great talk, and it was wonderful to actually learn about harps and have a demonstration of that. Cynthia is with the Landmark Society in Monroe County and has done some work with Victor, helped out with I think with the barns, at making a list of houses and looked at historic homes. And tonight she'll be talking about some of the historic homes in Victor. So, Cynthia Howk.
Since COVID, this is the first talk I've done in about 3 years, so it's nice to be back and doing this. Thank you all for coming tonight. And I have a long association with Victor, New York, certainly with Babette and I. We've had many adventures up in the archives with Wilma, who is your deputy historian, and we did an inventory of looking at every building in the village and the town about 4 years ago to develop a list of the buildings that are building structures, objects, and sites that are historically significant. So everything that was 50 or more years old, that does not include anybody in this room, is potentially historic, and that's based on not my opinion or Babette's, but when we look at buildings and structures in a community, we're looking at what represents your community. And 50 years old is about what the National Park Service has set up. It's not my thoughts. We have a whole methodology that we use when we do one of these inventories. In fact, I think your house probably is over 40 years, right, Chauncey? Oh,
Just 40, yes.
yes, well, I'd like to get that designated. You can become historic before it's 40 years old, and Chauncey Young has a remarkably interesting, technologically, probably one of the first in the region. So it's not just houses and buildings that were built before any of us were alive. It can be something that's very special, that is more recent, that is considered significant in terms of being historic. Because I think most people are comfortable looking at buildings that were built before they were born, to think of them as historic. So that is a surprise when they hear that 50 years old or older is the national guideline that we use. Now, how many of you have ever driven every road in the town and village of Victor? I have. Maybe if the town assessor is here, or some realtors. It is one of the most fascinating and interesting adventures that you can do in a community. You know, we get in our cars and we go to Washington, D.C., or we go to someplace else that's big. But how often do we go and drive around our own community as a tourist and take a look at everything? When I did a study in the town of Greece, New York, there were people who lived up on Lake Ontario on Edgemere Drive that had no idea that the Erie Canal came through Greece at the south end. They'd never been down there. And we all get into our ruts, you know, we drive the same way. I don't. I go like 6 different streets because I want to know what's going on. It makes it much more interesting. So that's one of my assignments when I do something like a talk like this. I want to make you dangerous drivers within reason. That you might start going out and say, you know, I never drove over there. What's Gillis Road? I've never been down there. Or what did she show on that slide? You know, what is she talking about? I've never been to that part of the village or town. Go do it. I did a little run around tonight so I could refresh myself. Because you have interesting and historic properties right here in town, some of which you may never have seen, or I hope tonight when we look at the slides, you'll go, I've always wondered about that building, and now she told me why it looks that way. And if you have questions, I hope we do that at the end. Now, I work at the Landmark. I retired from the Landmark Society of Western New York last fall with conditions. I'm still doing programs and talks. But to let you know how important the architecture is in our immediate Rochester area, this wonderful book, Field Guide to American Houses, the New York Times called it the best book ever written on American houses, whether they were built in the 1600s or they were built 10 years ago. And see all of these pink markers up here? The couple that wrote this book came to the Landmark Society offices in the 1980s to look at photographs, and they picked a whole bunch of photographs from the greater Rochester area to include in this book. How many of you are bird watchers and have seen a field guide? That's what this is. You know, in the bird book, there's the warblers, and there's the geese, and the swan, and the raptors. That's how this book is. No one has ever written a book quite like this, and it's fascinating to look at, going, wow, look at, there's a building in Pennsylvania that looks just like something on Maple Avenue in Victor, New York. How come that happened? Well, we're going to talk about that tonight, but this is, if you never buy another book on American architecture, and Mrs. McAllister updated this a couple years ago. Field Guide to American Architecture is it. I tell realtors, this is what you need to have in the car with you. Welcome to Victor. Victor was named after a man, actually a middle name of one of the Boughtons, who were here really early. And you've done some really nice promotional, your banners are lovely, but not only have you modern things to promote the community, you've done really well in protecting things. And I don't know how many of you have seen the horse water trough. I'm not sure about how this got moved and positioned. It's over in the park, correct? This is a lovely touch, and it says something about your community. It doesn't look like anything else. Whoops, it's a little too faint. Of course, before the settlers from the East Coast came, there were hundreds and hundreds of years of Native American settlement. And Ganondagan here, just south of Victor, is the only state-owned historic site in all of New York State that focuses on the Native American residents here in New York State. If you have not been out to Ganondagan's spectacularly, beautifully designed modern facility that was designed to be below the hill so it wouldn't impose itself on the rural nature of Ganondagan, be sure to put that on your must-see list. It's a really spectacular experience. But after the Revolutionary War in the 1780s and 90s, of course, a lot of land opened in what is now Western New York, although Massachusetts, I don't know if you realized it, Massachusetts claimed all of this land. When you look at a map, Massachusetts said, well, look, if we just sort of keep looking west all the way to Lake Erie, that should all be Massachusetts. Well, it turned out it wasn't. But a lot of land developers, just like land developers today were grabby, and they said, ooh, 20 cents an acre, look what we can buy. And they had heard about the incredible fertile nature of so people started coming to the western lands. This was America's frontier. We're not talking about Ohio, Missouri, Texas, or California. And it took a long time to get out here. There was only one road across the state. You know it as Route 5 and 20. And surprisingly, most people came in the winter. There's a newspaper ad that said, last weekend, 1,200 sleighs left Albany for the western lands because there were no road crews. It was a lot easier to come on a frozen Route 5 and 20 than the mud hole you could have gotten stuck in. So the next time you complain about snow and ice, think of those first settlers who actually were coming out here in the wintertime. And it would take them 30 days from Albany. That would change. Yes, 30 days for where you're sitting right now. If you were pre-Erie Canal in the 1820s, it was a 30-day trip because you only had one road and conditions were not always great. When the canal opens in the 1820s, 4 days. That's the monumental transportation change that happened. And we explode as a state in terms of becoming the Empire State and tens of thousands of people coming west. And here, there were other roads being laid out. There was a stagecoach route between Canandaigua and where we're sitting today. This was not the village. It was up on Boughton Hill, where there was the tavern that you see today in a federal style, built by Mr. Wilmarth. And when the stagecoach stopped, because eventually the road came the way we come into to the village today, instead of going by way of Boughton Hill. But the first styles of architecture here in the western New York region are what we call federal style. Some books call it different names, but federal is mostly it. These were the buildings that the people moving here from New England, this is the style they knew from New England. It faces the road, it has side gables, possibly this house had a center chimney, it has end chimneys, but I'm not, often some of these early buildings from the 1790s and early 1800s, they had a central chimney off of which all of the fireplaces. I don't know if there's, I bet if there's anything that survives here in town that has a central chimney. Probably in Canandaigua there might still be some, but this was pretty early. This was brick, quite rare, because most everybody was building out of wood. That was the most available. But in the case of this house, these bricks were made, I think it said, in a ravine behind the town hall. So there was a local deposit of clay. It was made right here, and they would have kilns. In the town of Brighton for 100 years, there were a lot of kilns on farms. That was their main industry in Brighton, New York, was brick making right on these farmsteads. So when you look at this building, it's symmetrical. That means if you look at the left half, it's the same as the right half. You have a center entrance, and it has a center hallway. It's 5 bays wide, each one of those windows and doors that you see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across the front. This is a very typical layout for federal-style architecture of the 1790s through the 1820s. Now, one thing I want to say before we go to the other slides, styles do not change overnight. It isn't one year you have this style and the next year. How many of you have things in your closets that are more than 20 years old and will admit it? All right, well, that's the same thing with architecture. Some styles, if you're in a rural area, some styles stay for a much longer period of time than if you're in a city. So when I say it's something's from about the 1790s to the 1820s, it's all very fluid. In fact, I know one house that's in a certain style that was built 20 years after the style went out of fashion because that lady wanted a house of that style, and golly, she got it. It's up in Webster on Main Street. This is one of your oldest houses. This is Break of Day, and this is stone. It's your only stone-built house. Is it the only stone-built building, Babette? And I'm assuming they had a quarry nearby, because when this was built, transportation was so difficult. but this is a very rarity. It's a very simple house. One thing I want to make clear is architectural and historical significance is not based simply on big, fancy versus small and tiny. A lot of people think, well, it's not a big, fancy house with rich people, and that's a misnomer. When we drive around and look at anything in a community, we don't say, is it big, is it small, is it pretty, or it's ugly. That tells us nothing. When we look at a house or a building like this, the first question we ask, what does this building represent for this community? What is it telling us about Victor, New York? We're not worrying about that it's not in Pittsford, it's not in Greece, it's not in Walworth. What is this telling you about your community? Local significance is very important. It isn't just George Washington stayed here or Thomas Jefferson built it. So when you're looking at a very modest house like this is extremely important because it's a rare example of this federal style, that's the way it looks, constructed out of stone, because you don't have any others. Now, you could go to other communities and see a lot of stone houses, but again, we're looking at this in the terms of how is it important to you here in Victor. Now, up on Boughton Hill, we have not only the former tavern, but we also have the former cemetery, which is a whole talk on its own with all the different styles of gravestones. The one in the front that I want to mention on the right was a remarkable company in Connecticut that made white zinc monuments for just 10 years, and they are one of the few products in the United States that have lived up to its renown. Even though many of these are now 120 or 30 years old, they look like they just came from the factory. They look spanking new. So we have, it's fabulous. I've never seen one quite this large or elaborate. So the next time, if you have a nice afternoon, there's nothing greater, more fun than driving around cemeteries. I was in Woodlawn in Canandaigua last weekend, having a lot of fun looking at foliage and architectural design and talking to the, if you haven't been in Woodlawn, the spectacular restored chapel that after 60 years being empty is now beautifully restored and being used again. And a lot of people don't know where Woodlawn is because it's tucked away on North Pearl Street. So there's an adventure for you on Foliage Drive in Woodlawn. Now we're going to come down to the village because the Boughton Four Corners did not remain a settlement for too long. It was a lot easier for the stagecoaches to stay down on the flats, so they came out 322 and then up through 96. Your village poses some challenges because you're in a valley. This part of the village is up against that hill, and that has proven some very interesting challenges over the years in terms of settlement. Some of the first buildings are still here. This is on West Main Street. You have, built in 1818, the CV Wagon Shop is still intact. And right out here at the corner, this was a building I photographed but didn't realize how important it was. This is a federal-style building. You can see the gable, the side gable, and it has 4 windows, not 5 across the front. It does have some modern siding, but according to the book, this is where a small religious sect called Millerites met in the 19th century. They thought the world was coming to an end, and then it didn't, so they kind of broke up they weren't terribly successful after that event didn't happen. But this is a very important building for its affiliation with the Millerites, spelled Millerites, and it is an early example. How do I know that? I'm looking at modern siding, modern windows, but look at the gable comes down, and then those 2 ends, we call those returns. That's part of federal design, and it's a side gable. The gables don't face the road. So right out here, this modest house on Main Street has some remarkable history affiliated with it. Now, looking at a book on styles, and going back to your wardrobes, you mix and match when you have your wardrobes, correct? You have something that you bought last week, something you bought 40 years ago, and the same thing happens in architecture. This is out in Railroad Mills, and it is a federal-style house. It has a very narrow cornice. That's that white band that comes down along the roof. But it has had an enclosed addition put on it. It still has, it has wood siding. And take a look at the windows. They are 9/6. The upper sash, that's the part that moves, is 9 panes, and the bottom is 6. At the time these were being built in the early 19th century, Americans did not know how to make big pieces of glass. Glass came only in small panes, which is why you see all of these when I see these, first of all, I'm thrilled that the wood window sash are still there because they're going to last a lot longer than vinyl. And these are probably mostly older pieces of glass because they're small from pre-Civil War time. So that's a really important feature of the house that we're always thrilled to see intact. Whoops, too far. This is one of my favorite houses. I was so excited when I discovered this. This is in East Victor, and it's up on the 96 in the corner of Road. I just drove past. Is that the East Victor Road? This is a remarkable house of federal design. Now, this isn't just a side gable. You have a front gable facing this way, and it actually faces 96. You don't see it immediately till you, it has a very big front lawn. And then there's this wing that comes out to the right. This has the small panes of glass. It has its wood shingle siding. Up in that front gable, it looks like a fan, and we call it that. Those are all handmade. There's a beautiful fan detail on this house. And there you can see it on the end. This is a marvelous, very little changed example of federal style architecture. I want to put a glass globe right over it. Does anyone know who lives here? Because I've never, Babette, do you know who's in this house? This is a remarkable property, and if you look at those windows, they are 12 over 12. Those are all the little panes of early 19th century glass. So this is a real superstar of a federal style building here in Victor, New York. And because unless you turn on that side road, I'll bet many of you have never seen this house, even though it faces 96. I want to meet the owners. Now, there are other houses that have been updated and modernized. This is no longer used as a restaurant, but it was a very important property that was saved, and even though there is the car wash next to it, this is a very early federal style building. Notice again that beautiful fan-shaped design at the front gable. That's purely decorative, but that was all done with hand tools. So you have to remember at this point in time, you're using hand tools, and these are timber-framed buildings where you've got mortise and tenon fitting into each other, which is not the way we construct buildings today. We use something called balloon frame. So these are really heavily built with the timbers you cut right out of the wood, sometimes in the basement. How many of you have dirt basements in your home? Do you have any logs that still have the bark on them? It was a little faster than cutting them. So that's what we're talking about with these. These were really built to last. This is up on Piety Hill, is that correct? Another federal style house, and I'm just showing you there's all kinds of variations, but these are your earliest building styles here in Victor. This is north, this is a little bit different now. We're going to start transitioning into Greek Revival, which is the next style. Now, this is what happens in the United States of America. We're always looking for something new. Some things never change. And when the Erie Canal finally opens in the 1820s, that 30-day trip we talked about is now 4 days to get across the state. And we see people learning more about other types of architecture, and they start to publish books, just like you can get a magazine today, 100 plans for houses under 1,500 square feet. You've seen these. These are not new. They had designer books. They called them plan books that you could buy as early as the 1820s and 30s. So if I hired Chauncey Young, and he was a carpenter in 1830, but he didn't have any local library, and I had one of these books, I could say, see this drawing on page 39? I want that house, Chauncey, and they've got the floor plan, and it shows there's a drawing. Can you build it for me? And this might have been designed by an architect in New York City in one of these plan books. But I had Chauncey there, and he goes, yeah, I can do that. So that's how you start getting a lot of these styles all over the United States of America. These plan books are sold everywhere. And Chauncey and all of his thousands of carpenter colleagues, they can just look at these books and then go, I know how to make this house. So a house like this, which is a little more elaborately done than the houses we've seen, this is Greek Revival. And Americans are starting to look at classical architecture that's coming from Europe, because again, they're starting to look at publications. And the other thing that's interesting is Americans are looking to classical architecture because we're a new country, and we're looking at the ancient Greeks who started the first democratic government. And in the 1830s, the Greeks had their own revolutionary war. They were trying to throw the Turks out. And Americans really identified with that. They said, well, look at, we did this with Great Britain, so look at, the Greeks are trying to get their government back. So everything to do with classical design and classical architecture, that is what you start to see in this beautifully designed doorway that has, we call those side lights, those two rectangular windows on either side, beautifully carved, all done by hand, woodwork with that, we call it the surround, the woodwork around the door. And those side lights were really important because you only had tallow candles probably lighting your interior. So you wanted to get as much natural light inside this center hall. And so having that kind of window on either side was really helpful. There are a number of lovely doorways hidden around town. This is a house on East Main Street. And this has an additional feature. We start to have people that can do metal work. And on either side of those side lights, that's very, very delicate wrought iron. Those are not grills that they bought at Home Depot. Those are from the early 19th century. So I don't think I saw that on any other house. Very important. Other Greek Revival houses include a more modest house. This is up at Valentine, but it has a wonderfully elegant doorway. Look at how beautifully that's done. And those flat pieces of wood on either side, we don't call those columns, we call those pilasters because they're actually attached to the house. Greek Revival is everywhere. No other style ever in New York State was more prevalent because we were exploding with development in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. And that's when thousands of people were coming into the state, settling the Genesee Valley, the far west, the North Country. So you see these variations of Greek Revival everywhere, and you have a lot of Greek Revival style houses around Victor. Some have big porches. This is up Rowley. Yes, this is Rowley. This is the one house that I know has a wraparound porch like that with the square Greek Revival style columns. You have beautiful, beautiful doorways that are part of the Greek Revival style. Here is the wooden house on, thank you, I knew it was over by Fisher's. And another thing I want to point out about the Greek Revival, look under the gable. See that wide white board? That's a cornice, and this is much wider than the cornice we saw on Federal style. The Greek Revival style gets really bolder and bigger. So you have these very wide details up around the roof line. The Fisher's house over in Fisher's is another example of this Greek Revival era. And are there still Fisher family living there? It's extremely unusual. Maple Avenue, one of the least altered houses anywhere in the community. This is a beautiful example of, again, the Greek Revival style with this time a triangular shaped gable that faces the front of the street. And you can see those nice square pillars, columns, and the beautiful 6/6 windows that are all intact. Now, wood was the most common type of building material, but obviously there was clay here in the community. So this is one of the very few brick-built Greek Revival houses I found when I was driving around, and it's right out here on East Main Street. And again, you can see that wide white board, that wide cornice. And this one happens to have the gable facing the road, and it has a side wing, although that front porch has been enclosed. I'm going to go quickly through. These are all themes and variations of the Greek Revival style that was popular from the 1830s actually, till about the Civil War in the 1860s. Some have a small porch. Some have no porch. This is wonderful because it has the original clapboard. And those flat corner pieces, again, are called pilasters. That's a really important detail that sometimes gets hidden when you put modern siding on. Here's yet another version of the Greek Revival style with the wide cornice. And with those different colors, you can see the different parts of the house. Whoops, I put that in the second time. Another variation, this has 9/6 windows. This is up, I think, toward the high school on High Street. Now, this has something we haven't mentioned. See those little tiny rectangular windows that are marching across the front of the house? That part of the cornice is called a frieze board, F-R-I-E-Z-E, and those are frieze windows. And oftentimes, that type of a window actually slides back into the wall. I don't know if any of you have a house like this. For years, I wondered how they opened those windows. Well, those little sash, actually, in many cases, they slide back into the wall. So, and that is actually a full second story, but it doesn't quite look that way. This house is north of town and is undergoing a remarkable renovation. I remember talking to the gentleman who's doing this house, but I can't remember his name. This is the one house that has a very grand two-story portico, not a porch, but a portico. And when you walk around the side of it, it still has the attached woodshed, which is quite rare. And if you look way over to the left, it has a stone smokehouse that survives. So this is a remarkable property just north of the village. Now, these frieze windows, if you look very carefully, have something that was another decorative feature. On the front, if you look, they look dark and they sort of look like lace. Those are cast iron grills that are strictly there for decoration. But oftentimes, this was the sort of thing that in World War I and World War II, these often were melted down when they had metal drives. So it's really wonderful to see when these decorative iron grills are still in place on a historic house. And with this house, we have the additional bonus of having a stone smokehouse that has survived in the backyard. Have you ever done a survey of how many smoke and do you still have a privy or two still in the town? I know of one on Maple Avenue, but it's part of the building. Oh, okay. Cobblestone, perfect introduction. Cobblestone is not a style of architecture. It is a construction method. And what you are looking at is a veneer. Those beautiful stones that are all lined up in those beautiful horizontal rows, that is not holding up the house. That is a veneer. These are actually field stone walls, and they're usually about this thick. And then there's this veneer, like you can see in the illustration in front here on the bone steel house. That is a veneer of beautifully matched stones. Now, I want to get something perfectly straight, because I have a feeling some of you have heard some of these fairy tales, and none of them are true. One thing that we estimate, there were possibly 1,000 cobblestone buildings erected in North America somewhere between about the 1830s and the 1860s. This is a very fluid type of data gathering. We don't know where the first cobblestone building was erected. There simply are no records. We don't know who brought this idea to North America. I have seen this in Brighton, England, a cobblestone wall looks just like something here in Victor. There is a running rumor that, well, when they built the Erie Canal, there were all these Irish masons who came here to build the canal, and when they were finished, they didn't have a job, so they said, let's start building cobblestone houses. That is absolutely a fallacy. There were a few Irish masons, but the big Irish immigration wasn't until the late 1840s, way past when cobblestones were starting to be built. So they have yet to find out who brought this idea to North America, because there's no precedent anywhere else. It was approximately 1,000 buildings. 90% of all cobblestone buildings in North America are within a 2-hour drive of Rochester, New York. We are the world center of cobblestone construction. Yes, there's one cobblestone house in Massachusetts. There are a number out along the Great Lakes states, because some of the people that were here in Western New York, they moved along to Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. There are no cobblestone houses in Pennsylvania or any kind of cobblestone building. Up in the North Country of the Adirondacks, there are cut stone houses, but this very specific construction type of field stone support wall with a veneer of cobblestone is something I always just took for granted till I went away to college and people didn't know what I was talking about. And my brother's roommate, who lived on Long Island, when he first saw one of these from a distance, he said, "What are those potato houses out in Mendon?" Which became actually the title of a magazine article some years later. He had never, living in Long Island, he had seen cut stone. He had never seen this, and he was an architecture student. He was thrilled. He didn't know what he was looking at. So it's a highly skilled and slow process because the mortar was very soft. There's a lot of sand in it. So you could only put a certain number of rows in one day, and then you had to let the mortar set. Then you could do the next. A lot of times, because it was expensive, you just had the front of your house done in cobblestone, and you just had field stone on the sides or the back. I saw one house recently out near Clarendon. He paid a lot of money. Every four sides of his house are all cobblestone, and each one of them, instead of just having that little tiny ridge in the mortar, each one of the cobbles on his house has a little frame around it. So there's both vertical and horizontal, these little pinched, beautiful pieces of masonry, and they are perfect because this house must have tens of thousands of stones in it, and they are all exactly the same. How many stones did you have to haul and go through? And most of the cobblestone buildings are up here in this part of northern. I did a program down in Hornell. Now, you know, that's way down near the Pennsylvania border. They, for years, had claimed there was only one cobblestone house in Steuben County until I went up on High Street in Hornell. There's this huge Italianate house, and it's cobblestone. And we didn't know, nobody knew about it. So that's pretty rare. You don't see them like in Steuben County and Cattaraugus. They're really closer to the lake where there's more glacial activity. So these are great, great, wonderful treasures for whoever has them. Now, you had about 22, I believe, buildings, cobblestone, and there's 14 now. I know the Gallup store burned in 893, but you still have the Simon store across the street. This is the second oldest railroad building in the country. Yes, it's on the National Register. This is the railroad pump house out in Fishers, a remarkable transportation building, extremely rare, and a very unusual build of cobblestone. Another cobblestone house. We're just going to go and look at all the different, most of them are either in the Federal style or the Greek Revival style, but they are built of cobblestone. Yes?
Are all the cobblestone houses, is cobblestone strictly appearance?
Yes, it has nothing to do with the style of the building. It's here's the wall. The wall is fieldstone, and then you put those, at the corner, that's called a quoin, Q-U-O-I-N. They're usually of limestone. But then you have on this building, you've got a porch that's later on from like the 1880s and 90s. So it's the way the wall is built. It's not the details of the design of the house. Does that answer your question? Because it's different, the technology, how it's built is different than design style, how it looks. Oops, too far. Greek Revival style, and this has frieze windows with the original decorative grills. This has a beautiful porch that was added probably about 50 years later, but that's now part of the history of the house. This is out at the corner of Thank you. Federal style, it has a beautiful fan in the gable if you look quickly. Here's another Federal style cobblestone house, recently restored. That's the front door. All of that beautiful detail on the front door, that was all done with hand tools, exquisitely sophisticated. Some of us that have electric tools wouldn't attempt this. This was done with hand tools. So this is some of the beautiful detailing, sometimes on a doorway. Sometimes you also see these on mantles. I know at the Granger Homestead in Canandaigua, they've got some of the most sophisticated mantles that look similar to this. This beautiful house, another Federal style, but is of cobblestone construction. And this has 12 over 12 wood window sash that are still in place. And then we have a lovely 1925 painting in front of me on the lectern of this house. This is the Bone Steel house up on High Street Extension. Now, this is a great demonstration of, here's a federal-style house. It's 5 bays wide, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 windows across, 12 over 12 windows. And like a lot of people today, somewhere in the 1870s, someone said, I'd really like a front porch in that Italianate style. So this is a later style we're going to see is called Italianate. They added that on. That's not bad. It's now part of the history of the house. So you can have more than one style when you're looking at a building. You have several commercial buildings. This is in East Victor. It's in the federal style. It has that beautiful fan at the front of the gable. And this has limestone details on the storefront itself, which is rather unusual, but that is part of the original design of the building.
Would you still call it a house if you didn't have fieldstone, or you had some other supporting the house?
Sure, but I don't know, there was really nothing else available to make the structural wall itself was fieldstone. So you wanted to be near someplace where you could get random, the fieldstone, when you see these walls underneath, they're randomly laid. The real finesse on this building, or I call it the frosting on the cake, is that beautifully laid, exquisitely detailed. Think of all the hours it took just to find these stones. I was just by a house on 96 over by Phelps, and they have barns that are cobblestone. And that house, they look like eggs. They are perfectly matched in size and color to find. They weren't making these in a mold in the backyard. They had to find these glacier stones. So we have a little bit of details of people. I think one of these buildings, Babette put it in her Victor book. There's a quote about how much she made, but we don't have a lot of written information about how these were built and who was doing them. That's the mystery. There's a lot of these, but we don't have any written records, and they didn't know anything about building permits in the 1830s. They simply didn't exist.
Types of stones by having holes and boards.
Thank you Chauncey's absolutely right. If you go to the Cobblestone Museum out in Childs, Orleans County, they have one of these measuring boards where they had different holes. And they'd often get all the kids together. I know my great-great-grandfather was involved with the Presbyterian Church, the first one up in Ontario, Wayne County, and they talk about the kids got together and everybody got together and you went out in Farmer Jones's field and you brought in all these stones, and then you had these boards that you could put them through different holes so you could get them sort of measured by size, but it was very, very time consuming. You could not do it today at what people get paid on an hourly basis. Though, I do want to make one, there is a building called White Springs Farm in Geneva, which is a very, very large cobblestone house, and the family that owned it in the early 20th century somehow found masons who still knew how to do 19th century cobblestone, and they doubled the house in size in about 1909, and it was done in traditional cobblestone masonry. It's dazzling to see, but they must have paid an immense amount of money to have this done. So occasionally there are exceptions to what I've said, that cobblestone masonry is roughly 1830s to 1860s. Of course, you have schoolhouses. And all of these buildings you can look at from the comfort of your home, because a spectacularly wonderful retired Kodak engineer has sat down and created the greatest inventory database that has every cobblestone building known on this database. Photographs, that you know about, I think. It's on the Cobblestone Society's webpage. It's called the Cobblestone Info Base, and if you type that in, you can see all of the pictures. He has put every known picture, all the data of every cobblestone building we have found in North America, and some that are sort of cobblestone but not really. So if you want to see all of these and the photos that have been taken here in Victor or anywhere else, go on the website to the Cobblestone Society, and you will go to the Cobblestone Information Base, and your family will never see you again, because you will be there for years looking at this spectacular inventory that Greg Lawrence has put together as a volunteer over the last 4 years. And he's always adding to it. So like when we found out about demolished buildings in Victor, he has added that database. So it isn't just existing cobblestones. We really want to see if we can find every the data of every cobblestone building that was ever done. Churches, houses of worship, struggling today in North America. Many of them have maintenance and other costs, and they don't have quite the population. There is a grant, though, out of New York that you can ask me about later, about funds to help you repair churches. But here in town, you have some magnificent churches. This is the oldest surviving. It is the Presbyterian church that was originally congregational. And even though this is an 1832 building, those round-headed windows were probably added in the 1850s or 60s. Those are actually Romanesque-style windows. The original windows in this would have been rectangular. So this has windows that were added a little bit later, but they're still very much historic because they've been there for decades. The round-headed window and door openings you will see in a lot of houses of worship in the 19th century. And as I said, it's called Romanesque design. It goes way back 1,000, 2,000 years to when the Romans figured out, if any of you are engineers, a rounded arch is an engineering challenge. Putting a flat arch over a door or window isn't a big deal. But if you're going to do a structural arch that's going to be round, there are engineering considerations. So the first rounded arches in architecture were back in ancient Roman times. If you've ever seen the aqueducts that the Romans built, all those round arches, that was an engineering triumph of the ancient world to figure out the engineering for Roman arches. So here we have a style that's been around for a long time, and you see a lot of Romanesque revival-style churches. Certainly on the Universalist Church, which is now a house of worship again, even though the Universalists left there in 1928. Here are the round-arched windows and doorways, very much a part of the mid-19th century Romanesque style of church architecture. This happens to be out of brick. And then your star of the show, the Methodist Church and its rectory. Very few campuses anywhere in Western New York have two buildings so spectacularly well-matched as a church and a parsonage. These have both, the church has Romanesque revival style, all those round arches, a tower. There's some of those round arches that I just mentioned of the Romanesque revival style of the 19th century. And next door, and a tower. They took the spire off in 1919. It had been struck by lightning 3 times. They said, I think it's telling us we need to take the spire down. So there are early pictures showing this having a I think it was 138 feet tall, the original pointed spire. And the next door, the house next door with that mansard roof. Now, what you don't know about this incredible building is the superstar architect that designed this. A man named John Rochester Rogers. He was not related to Colonel Rochester, who started the city of Rochester. John R. Rogers started his career in Rochester, New York in the 1860s and 70s, and then he was so successful he went to New York City. And if you Google his name on the internet, he will come up and it will say he was the most successful architect of public buildings in the United States in the late 19th century. John Rochester Rogers was a architectural superstar with a spectacularly successful business in New York City. He entered one competition and he designed 200 churches around the country just for the Methodist Church. So this is one of them that was part of this design. Sadly, he died of a heart attack at his summer home in the Thousand Islands. His family has terrible tragedies. They're all buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, and until recently, no one really knew of his renown because they're in such a modest plot. But you here have one of his truly great designs of a nationally famous architect. Are any of you members of the Methodist Church? I see people writing. The man's name is John Rochester Rogers, R-O-G-E-R-S. He died in, I think, 1905. He was born in Rochester. But this is this man became famous. He won a huge competition in New York City, and you can read all about it online. But you have 2 of his buildings these are documented that they are his. It's not just hearsay, because a lot of times we don't have building permits. These are documented Rogers buildings. I've always liked this church because with the design with the rectory, it's so eye-catching. And then when I found out it was Rogers' design, I was really excited. The newest building, the newest church building is up on Piety Hill. This was the German-speaking Lutherans who built this just after 1900. And this was originally in a very simple classical style of architecture. It was a very modest building. And the one building I can't show you because gone is the Episcopal Church, which was also up the hill, but they were only around for about 25 years and their building is gone. But it was, a lot of these other Protestant churches were built in the Romanesque design with the round arches because they didn't want people thinking they were an Episcopal church. The Episcopalians liked, as they called it, the only proper style. Episcopalians liked Gothic revival, pointed arches. That goes back to England, Great Britain, a lot of pointed arches in the cathedrals. You can drive through any village in western or central New York, and you can see it from a distance, and you know it's an Episcopal church because it's got pointed arches. If you go up here, and I still call it Holcomb, there's the Episcopal church in Holcomb, now Bloomfield. You can see from a block away, pointed arches. It's Gothic revival. So that's one of the reasons that some of the other Protestant denominations, and certainly the Catholic denomination, they wanted these Romanesque round-arched windows because then they wouldn't have been confused with those Episcopalians. If any of you are Episcopalians, don't take it. It's all in the history books. Now, this is one of the most elegant village buildings in Monroe or Ontario County. This is the kind of building you would see in a much larger community. So I'm assuming in the 1870s, before we had this big economic crash in 1873, which was worse than the 1930s, before the 1873 panic, that's what it was called, there was a lot of construction going on here in Victor and elsewhere, and this is one of the real grand buildings that was built at your Four Corners. This really made a statement. And this is more of Italian Renaissance design, not just a Romanesque, but it has those very beautiful blocks, the distinctive arches. This was an expensive building, and so my guess is the person who built this wanted to make a big statement. Across the street was the Victor Hotel, quite lovely. 2 cobblestone commercial buildings on the other corners, but there was nothing in town like this. So it'd be interesting to bring them back from the dead and have a long discussion, because this was a huge investment for your community to put up something like this when everything else was about 2 stories high. Now, when you walk around Victor, which I have, you get to see all kinds of art. It's an outdoor museum, and if you've never walked on your own sidewalks, you're always at 30 or something miles an hour, go take a little walk. You have sidewalks everywhere, and you get to see some wonderful things, like our next style, Italianate style, these beautiful square columns that at the corners, they're beveled or chamfered. And this is the Italianate style of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And you've got a lot of it. Here's another porch in the Italianate style. Very lovely, all done in wood. And this is now where you have trains have now come to most communities in the United States. So you can be shipping lumber from northern Michigan, and you can ship it anywhere in the country. You will be doing balloon frame construction when you're doing houses, not the mortise and tenon. So you can put buildings up faster, and you can get all of these details. Yes, they could be made locally, but they can also ship it in. And you had the Auburn Railroad, and then in the 90s you got the Lehigh. So you've had railroads since what? The 40s, I think, 1840s. So this did not have to be locally. In fact, there were catalogs at the end of the 19th century. You could order stained glass windows, sort of like Sears Roebuck. You could get all these details and building materials much cheaper, and they'd be brought in by rail, whether you were in Rochester, Victor, or the Adirondacks. Everybody had rail service. So you've got Italianate houses. Where did they come from? This is in Italy. Well, there were country houses in Italy, and people from England kind of saw this sort of square, boxy house with a little tower on the top, and the English started using that design, and then they got into books, and those published books came to North America, and those pattern books were distributed everywhere. They were sketches at this point. They weren't photographs. So you could have a really elegant Italianate house like this home on East Main Street that's right out of the textbook. You have a square, boxy-shaped building, and you have a hipped roof that has those big overhanging eaves, and that little box in the middle is a miniature version of a tower. It's called a cupola, and it's not only decorative, but when you open all the windows, all the hot air goes up through the cupola, so it's an early ventilation system for the house for staying cool. Now, this house and one other still has the remarkable wood finial at the top, and wood does something really well. It rots if you don't take care of it. So when we see these finials still intact after 130 or more years, it's really thrilling. Now, I have a question about this house because I'm really worried. What's going on the front lawn? Does anyone know? What? I'm going, somebody's doing something.
Changing the direction of the driveway so that it doesn't go down in such an angle.
Okay.
on Main Street.
Yeah, I nearly ran off the road. I thought, are they going to put, I had no idea what was going on, but I'm glad, thank you for providing the answer. But this is a really gorgeous example of this Italianate design. And there's the up-close finial on the top. Again, this, what you're looking at, it's a piece of wood that was probably put up there about 1880-something. So in our climate, that's not a small accomplishment. Here's a simpler farmhouse with a cupola on the top in the Italianate style. This is a little more elaborate. They love those brackets. This is north of town, up by the Lutheran church on, thank you. But this is brick, and you see those two windows that have shutters over them? Those aren't windows. Those are put there to show a balance on the outside. Those are false windows. There's a staircase behind that. That's a blank wall. So sometimes they will pull these tricks. That the outside of the house is symmetrical. They will put literally a false window, and they'll put shutters, and they have a limestone lintel on the top, and they have a limestone sill, but there really is no window behind that. Wilma was on the Landmark Society staff as a curator, and we had the Campbell Whittlesey house with a fake window. From the outside, you just thought the shutters were closed, but there was plaster behind it. They wanted that window to match the window below it. So that's why those windows are there. It's to give symmetry to the outside design. Oops. This is up at Ganondagan, another beautiful Italianate house, brick construction, so this was a little more expensive, and those gorgeous square chamfered posts that are a real trademark of the style. A little simpler design of an Italianate house, but it has a lovely front porch in that Italianate style, 6/6 windows. Yet another simpler, what we call a vernacular style house. It has a front gable facing the street and a side wing plan over to the right. And there are thousands of these houses everywhere, and they all have different porches. Some don't have a porch, but we just call it a front gable and side wing plan. And anywhere from the 1830s right till 1910s, this was a real popular style of a house. Now this house. When I was in 4th grade, I went to class with a girl who lived up my street in Rochester, and her name was Molly Harris. After 4th grade, her family moved away from our street and moved to the Osborne house. They were only the second family to purchase this spectacular and extremely important building that goes important way beyond just Victor, New York. The family that built it was actually her father, who made a lot of money, Mr. Bushnell up at Bushnell's Basin. This is a really slam dunk example of an Italianate style house. It has the cupola, it has the front porch, and it has still architectural drawings that have survived from when it was built. This was designed by the hotshot company, architecture firm known as Merwin Austin and Andrew Jackson Warner in Rochester, New York. I had the great thrill in the 1980s of Mrs. Harris taking me through the house, and I had wanted to see it for many, many years. And I wasn't disappointed because the Harrises had never changed the spectacular interior design or the decor. One of the things they have changed, this is a picture of the original front porch posts, and these are in the Egyptian style, another exotic style in the 19th century, where that sort of comes down, it looks like an onion with those leaves that come up. Those are not on the front porch any longer. They have put a different, but those are the original Egyptian style front porch columns on an Italianate house. The Osbornes have a very large plot up at the Boughton Hill Cemetery, as you can see by this huge granite marker. And here are some pictures taken about 30 years ago of the interior of the Osborne house. White marble mantelpieces. These were probably coal-fired fireplaces, not wood-burning. Beautiful plaster medallions in the ceilings. Now, I don't have a picture, but the front staircase goes up and around. Have any of you been in the Osborne house over the years? Or there's probably pictures online because it was for sale recently, and those pictures never seem to disappear. Whoops, too far. It's beautiful cove. These are like 14-foot ceilings. These are deeply molded plaster moldings around the top. And if you look really careful at the bottom, you'll see something that's sort of glimmery. Those are plaster details made to look like bamboo, and they are gilded with probably, not paint, but I think it's 14 karat gold leaf. So these have all survived from when the house was built in the 1850s, I believe. The other thing about this house that's remarkable, it has a split level latrine. When you look at the house on Maple Avenue, there's the big square front part of the house, and then it telescopes back. There's a smaller section, and then there's the last part of the house that's mostly brick and not any windows. That's the indoor bathroom. Now, over in Phelps, New York, they've got a 2-story attached. If you go to the Phelps Historical Society, they've got a double-decker. But in this house, you walk through the original kitchen, and then you walk through the wood shed, which is part of the brick house, and then you open this door, because Mrs. Harris took me there. You open this door, and you walk into a 2-seater, a 2-holer on that level. But there's a half wall that you look over the side of the half wall, and there's a 2-holer that you enter from the lawn. There is a door on the north side of the house at lawn level. So if somebody was taking care of the lawn or whatever, they can open that door and come in, and there's the 2-holer. So I call it the split level 4-holer latrine, but it's part of the brick house. It is not a wing or a separate building. It's just spectacular because it's still, now there's new owners. I hope they are leaving that as it was because it's so fascinating. But that was expensive design. You were not going outside to a separate building, nor did you have to rely simply on the covered commode underneath your bed upstairs. And I know what those are like because my mother visited a farmhouse in Pennsylvania in the 1940s, and that's what they still had. So I have talked to somebody who has used that system of the chamber pot under the bed. So this is the magnificent Osborne House on the National Register of Historic Places, one of the great Italianate houses in the region, and architect design. Now, architecture also goes to the rural areas, and this is on Benson Road. It's the 1870s Benson House. Their lovely their exterior porch has those Italianate columns. But I want to just do some discussion about agricultural buildings in addition to houses. I was thrilled when I said to Babette, well, we had a mental telepathy moment. I have a lot of barn slides, and she's going to be focusing on barns. Barns are a vanishing commodity for many different reasons. Barns changed over time because of technology. The gambrel roof barn we're seeing here with those double slopes came about because of a change in the way they put hay up in hay lofts. But you're very lucky in Victor in that you have a spectacular array of barns and agricultural buildings that have survived, and many of them are still being used. They are of different construction materials. This happens to be a silo of cast concrete block, which is yet another technology we'll talk about momentarily. The first barns that people had were these simple gable roof barns that were familiar in New England. And these barns are the epitome of form follows function. Barns are designed for the function they're going to use. When I used to visit my cousins in Steuben County, I couldn't understand why the cows were in the bottom of the barn. I thought they should be living upstairs where all the hay was. Well, I didn't know much about farming or technology, but it's a perfect design for the upper part is always storage, and the livestock are most always in the lower section. Later in the 19th century, some of these gable roof barns were expanded upwards into a double-pitched or gambrel roof, which we see here. And this is called a banked barn because you have that banked slope coming up into the building where you're going to be storing hay, other things, and machinery. So again, the form follows the function you're going to be using. You sometimes get both styles of buildings in a farm. Every farm complex is different because it depends on what that family was doing. These tell you so much. When I said you stand in front of a property and say, what does this tell you about Victor? This tells you so much. Americans, we were 90% of Americans lived in rural areas till 1900. Today, 90% of Americans live in urban areas. Kids didn't go to school. That wasn't the center of their world up until 1900. You went to a one-room schoolhouse. You didn't get the union school here till what, 1900-something or other? You went to school, and then if it was, how many of you, have any of you attended a one-room school? Because I have a friend who's, you know Fran Gotchick. She went to, 1950, she was in a one-room school in Webster. So I know that there are people that have gone one-room school, and my great-great-grandfather started as a school teacher, and I've got his diary. Well, we closed the school for 4 weeks because the kids had to go home and help with crops. That's how schools work. You know, agriculture today, our school system is still based on we're all running farms. You know, July and August, you're not in school. So each of these farms are specific to that farm at a specific point in time. As technology changes, this is a milk house, and those are not natural quarried stones. Those are cast concrete blocks that retain cool, because you want to keep your milk cool waiting for the big truck to come. This is, when this was built, probably around between the 1910s and the 1920s. This is a milk house of cast concrete block. We're going to look at it a little bit later on some houses. You had horse and buggy. This is the rare example I found in the town. This is up on High Street, I'm pretty sure. They have the cast iron hitching post. It's that black post. And there is, it looks like a limestone mounting block to help you get into the buggy or the sleigh. These used to be everywhere, but I think I saw 2 of them in the entire time I drove every road. And so this is really, really special and says something about a vanished way of life, other than it looks pretty on the front lawn. Now, in terms of agricultural buildings, again, something that was purpose-built was Valentine. It was a developer's dream that became a nightmare, probably. But he was really smart, and he had different levels you could put. I think they said you could stable 40 horses in the basement. That was pretty smart. And then the top floor was a ballroom combination of community center, and he had retail space. The only thing he didn't have was the railroad that he was hoping was going to get built nearby. But this, thanks to Sheldon Fisher and his prescience back in the 1940s when he bought it. This is a remarkable building that I was fascinated with as a child. I couldn't figure out what it was at the time. It was just something so different. And fortunately, you still have it. And here is a view of the upper floors when they have been turned into commercial or a museum. This doesn't really have a style to it. It's a very large, it's sort of a barn that got bigger. It has 4 walls, 3 stories, and a roof. So I really can't give it a style name because there's nothing really fancy. It is a very utilitarian but spectacularly important building for its cultural significance and its historic significance.
Is it used today at all?
Babette?
Open from May through October on Sundays, 1 to 4.
Victor Historical Society is still the steward of the property, correct? Okay.
If you got a group, you can get a group tour of it.
But it's never used just.
Oh, fire laws now, you could have a tent on the front lawn but to actually use this, I think, for group, you would have problems with the safety issues. Because when this was built in the 1870s, there wasn't something called New York State Building Codes. Yeah.
I actually think that was the first mall.
Yes, that is often described as the first mall. I've never seen in all the different books I've looked at on American architecture, I've never seen something like this in another rural area. It's a really remarkable building. and the fact that it didn't get eaten up by the shopping plaza monster is just unbelievable.
I almost think Eastview Mall, I mean, it's a good thing they didn't take ownership of it.
Well, Eastview Mall took down the barns for the Bone Steel House were there. And speaking of malls, they're going to be there has not been a new mall built in North America in 30 years. Malls are on their way out. And you can see that up in, I just went through past the former Arundecoit Mall on Ridge Road. They have just added a wing of apartments. And a whole wing of that mall is going to be the new town recreation and community center. So yes, malls are no longer, you now go back to strip plazas. They're cheaper to build. And you can see that across from Eastview Mall. But no, malls have ceased to be a reasonable economic plan. So yeah, someday I'm sure there's some mall that's going to probably get on the National Register shortly because they say something about a time and place, and they are not building them anymore. Other Italianate houses, and I'm watching the clock because there's a lot to look at. So we have these around town, Italianate front porch with the square columns, but now we're going into, I am so partial to this style of architecture, Gothic Revival. We are now in the 19th century. You've probably heard of like romantic authors and romantic poems and the romantic area, the picturesque period. That's what we're all looking at now, and this is the Gothic Revival style, a style that easily is changed because all those little pieces of wood that define the exterior are often taken off and replaced. You have several absolutely stunning Gothic Revival style houses, and they're both on Main Street. And you had two more that are still there, but they've been remodeled up here on Webster Heights. There are pictures in Babette's book of the Webster Heights. This is, again, a picturesque style that wanted to be very vertical. All those pointed gables that you're seeing, this does not look like an Italianate house, which is more like a box. And they wanted to really emphasize that it was vertical by those little narrow battens, B-A-T-T-E-N. We call the siding on this board and batten. It's all wood, and it's to make a picturesque looking house, sort of like something out of a fairy tale. But again, it's a style that's coming from Europe, and then it hits the eastern seaboard, and you can find, there's a man named A.J. Downing, who was a real smart marketer. He wrote a lot of books called The Rural Cottage, or The Rural This, or The Picturesque That. And again, Chauncey Young, I'd have him at my house and say, see plate number 22 in Mr. Downing's book? I want that on East Main Street in Victor. So I don't know if this came from one of those pattern books. It's possible, but we haven't done the research. So here is one of the rare surviving Gothic Revival houses in the area. There's that steeply pitched gable and that round arch. Sometimes the arches over the windows are pointed, but this one happens to be round. That's fine. The louvered shutters. Just down the street, another example of this picturesque Gothic Revival style with the board and batten siding. And on the front of the roof, you see a finial that sticks up and a pendant that extends down. We have names for a lot of these parts of the house. The one thing these two don't have, but I think they did originally, along the gable, they usually had this very lacy, we call them barge boards or verge boards. And they were made possible by a new invention in the 1840s, something called the scroll saw. The invention of the scroll saw let carpenters make these curvy cuts on these beautiful lacy houses that I'm guessing these originally had these very decorative barge boards, but again, those are wood, they're not taken care of, they often deteriorate. Yeah, the pictures in there, those are the two houses that are up here on Webster Heights. So these are remarkable. For me to drive down and see two surviving Gothic Revival houses within a few houses of each other is a pretty rare situation in any community. Now, on West Main Street, this is another Gothic revival house, but it has had modern vinyl siding, but you can still see pointed arch windows and those steeply pitched gables. Now, we're going to get into the middle of the 19th century when lots of different styles are used, and they're all mixed and matched together. Here's a brick house that has a mansard roof, and it has what we call stick-style wood details. This isn't just one style. In the late 19th century, you get a lot of different styles mixed together, and that makes the building even more exciting. It does not make it less important. We have towers that become popular in the French style known as Second Empire with mansard roof out of France. Here's somewhat of an Italianate house, but you really can't put your finger on a single design, but it's a very important piece of 19th century design. More beautiful porches of the period. And porches were not just there to look pretty. Ladies, we were wearing corsets and petticoats. And gentlemen, you were in wool pants and starched shirts. And there was no such thing as casual clothing, and there was no electricity to put a fan on. So when this is not as deep, but a lot of by the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, you have front porches that are about 8 to 10 feet wide because that was your summer living room. You brought the furniture out and you hoped there was a breeze because there was no other way to cool off. So porches are not just sort of a decorative fluff that was added. They truly were built very wide, and they had a sloped floor, so if it rained, the rain would drain off. It wasn't that the carpenter was having a bad day, that they didn't make it flat. You wanted the rain to drain off, but I know in my own neighborhood, which was built between the 1910s and 20s, I go on one street, every house has a front porch that's about 10 feet wide because everybody was out on the front porch. The next street, the houses were from the 1920s, only half of the houses had front porches because electricity is coming in, electric fans. Ladies, we were no longer in corsets. Gentlemen, you weren't just in wool pants and a starched shirt. Oh, and gentlemen, your collars were separate. Do any of you remember seeing those shirts? The men's collars were separate, so you could switch the collar off, but you didn't have to launder the shirt. So these front porches become very important. And they are on every house because you sat out there in the summertime. They were an intrinsic part, not just something to look fancy. So you see porches everywhere. This is a beautiful house on Maple Avenue that's more of the stick style, and you can see that cut out beautiful decorative board in the front gable. That's some of the kind of fancy woodwork you could do with a scroll saw, and has fortunately been retained on this house. Here's another view of that beautiful decorative woodwork. People remodeled their houses. Martha Stewart did not invent house remodeling. People have always updated their houses, no matter where they lived. This is that wonderful federal-style house in East Victor that I said I want to go inside. Somebody in that family in the 1880s decided they'd like a beautiful Queen Anne side porch. So this porch is probably 50 or 60 years after the first part of the house, but that those exquisite, really delicately carved columns are still here in the year 2022 is no small accomplishment, because this sort of woodwork easily rots over the years. The Second Empire style in this picturesque, we copied from a lot of people, and we had the Italianate house. Now we're going to go to Paris, France. Paris, France was going through a big remodeling in the mid-19th century, all those boulevards and new buildings. And this funny-looking roof that sort of looks like the attic without windows, this was a roof that was invented in the 1600s by an architect whose last name was Mansart, M-A-N-S-A-R-T, Monsieur Mansart. We call it a mansard roof, and these were wildly popular. This style of architecture, the Americans that went to France, or we saw magazines and books coming over from France, and we said, ooh, look at that, because it gave you an extra story. Sometimes you'd take a two-story house that was already built, and you wanted an attic. My great-grandfather did this out in Ontario, New York with his store. So he added not just an attic, he added a mansard roof that actually gave my great-great-grandmother the attic she always wanted, because before that it was just a flat roof. So here is, in Victor, New York, brought to you from Paris, France, Second Empire-style French architecture with that mansard-type roof in many different variations. This is a really spectacular house on East Main Street that has towers, and the one on the side, we sometimes call that a pavilion, not just a tower, and there's a beautiful carriage barn as part of the ensemble that was designed for that property that I believe had physicians in residence for 100 years. This was a doctor's house. The Queen Anne style is the next we're going to look at quickly. This was nothing to do with Queen Anne. She had been dead for 150 years. But it's more taking what you could do with woodwork and apply it to the outside. Now, this is a house that's being renovated outside, but this is a great example of a Queen Anne house where more is more. If you can put woodwork anywhere on the outside of the house, this is what you did during the Queen Anne period. You put a porch with a railing, that little thing at the top with little tiny, that's called a spindled frieze, F-R-I-E-Z-E. The front of the house could have had wood clapboard, wood shingles, all kinds of decorative woodwork that you could bring in to the lumber yard by rail or order through a catalog. Now, I don't know what this is going to look like when it's finished, or maybe it's a little bit more finished. A little more finished. But this is, and look at the roof line. Look at how busy that roof is. Shingle, gables everywhere. This is not your symmetrical federal style house. This is the picturesque movement of the 1880s and 90s. Whoops. And they will do all sorts of things. This is on East Main Street. Look at the little tiny porch that's on the second floor that's just there for decoration, for no other purpose, because Queen Anne, if you can find a surface to put something on it, they did it. And here's a great example that survived. Now, I wanted to look at a few more agricultural buildings because they're so important, and I enjoyed this mailbox that here's some of the examples. Here's just a lot of different barns that have been beautifully renovated and are used for storage and agriculture. And this is out at Railroad Mills, a really beautiful barn with a gorgeous stone foundation. Another ensemble of barns in the town. And a gambrel roof barn that an architect did what my mother wanted to do for 60 years, because I heard it all my life. I want to buy a barn and make it into a house. So I brought her to see George Baker's house. This is an architect who was ahead of his time. And if you've never been in Mr. Baker's house, when you walk into this, the barn is still all open. He's put in these different levels. He has not put like full ceilings and walls. It's really spectacular, but he was really ahead of the curve, and this is how some barns really have been able to survive. They have been cleverly adapted as houses, and this is one of the most exciting adaptive barns I've ever seen made into a residence. 2 gambrel roof barns, and a few commercial buildings that have survived outside of downtown Victor. This is an 1880s store over in Fishers that still has its original storefront on it. Very unusual, because often these have been turned into apartments. So this is quite remarkable that the storefront and windows are intact. Now, technology. When you first look at this house that was built around 1900, it looks like it's got a stone first story and a wood second story, and you would be wrong. This is a patented invention from 1890 something, and that is, you know how when you make bread, you put dough in a pan and you put it in the oven and it comes out as a loaf? That's basically how these blocks were made. There's a patent, and they made different forms to make different styles of concrete blocks. That is concrete. Some of the forms, when you took the concrete out of them, they look like carved stone. Like this has got sort of rough edges. That's because the form was rough edged. Other forms are smooth and they have a beveled edge. And these forms were really cheap, and any lumber yard in America could buy them and crank out their own concrete blocks. Now, some people use these concrete blocks just for the foundation, but here is an example that it was used for the first floor. And they had a real interesting marketing scheme. They said, "We are vermin-free and fireproof if you build with our cast concrete blocks." Fire was a problem. You had a lot of fires. In fact, you didn't have a fire department are you still with the fire department, Chauncey? You're retired. There was no fire department they talk about your fire on the east side, the north side of East Main Street. Everybody came down to watch the fire, but there wasn't anyone there to put it out, because you literally didn't have any fire department. People don't remember that America, for a long time, there were no fire departments. You just watched things burn. So this marketing approach to maintenance-free, you didn't have to paint it, although I see people that paint them, I've never understood that. Maintenance-free, vermin-free, and fireproof. A lot of the first garages, that new car uses oil and gasoline, highly flammable. Some of the first service garages and people's garages in the backyard were made of these concrete blocks because they were worried about fire. The gentleman who built this house, is it Mr. Longyear? I believe so. This is on East Main Street. This is a very sophisticated house, and I suspect there may have been an architect. The first story of that house and the front porch are all of those cast concrete blocks, but it looks like stone, but it's a lot cheaper. But look at that upper story. It's got those beautiful yellow painted wood shingles and that decorative window bay that comes out very gracefully from the house, and that three-part window in the front gable, we call that a Palladian window. This is not just Mr. Generic Builder. I suspect this might have had an architect's hand, and you've got some houses I'm going to show you that are architect designed from this 1905, 1910 period. But the gentleman that built this house must have really loved concrete block, because he submitted the plan that became, there's his front. And yes, he uses tinted mortar. That's mortar that's been tinted red, that is in between, that really fine detail. Nobody painted that. That's tinted mortar. That was another one of these lovely upscale details that you could add to a building, is tinted mortar. He built this, your first fire hall. Guess what it's built out of? Cast concrete blocks that are fireproof. That's a real smart idea if you have a fire department, to put it in a fireproof building. He also built this school on, is it pronounced Wangham Road? This is the Wangham Road School from 1907, 09, something like that. But these are cast concrete blocks. They are not quarried limestone, but they were cheaper, could be made right here in town if you had one of these forms, and they were highly resilient. This still looks, but usually when you look at them today, they look very new. There were even families who built their own houses out of these blocks. There's a big house out in the state of Washington. It's a Queen Anne house with a tower and like 13 rooms. The family that built it did it themselves. They made their own blocks in the backyard, and then they built the house. So these are, my cousin, when I used to talk to her, she said she never liked these buildings. They looked like they were basements because they were all of this block. It was a brilliantly conceived American-invented building form, popular from the 1890s to the 1930s, and there are thousands of buildings of it, but they're not appreciated or even recognized, because a lot of people think they're cut stone. In the village of Caledonia, New York, their first automobile garage is of this material, and in the front it says 1913. They put the date right up in the concrete, because again, they were worried about fire. This is gone, but I wanted to show it. This was your oldest, this was the lumber yard. And this is not cast, these are cinder blocks. This was another type of that inexpensive cast construction that were often used for commercial and industrial buildings. Whoops. Main Street has changed. We just talked about fire. You had fires, Caledonia had fires. Every village seems to have had fires that wiped out whole sections of downtown, which is when laws changed. And afterwards, the reason you have all brick downtown now is because the previous buildings were all wood, and they've started putting in rules. And the new buildings that were constructed after the 1898 fire, I believe it's 98, you had to do brick building if you were going to build a commercial building downtown. You could not build wood any longer. This is Eileen Malone's house, which is Colonial Revival. Edward Malone was a successful realtor, or real retail shop on Main Street in the Malone block, which burned in the 1980s, unfortunately. This has, if you look at the front gable, that's that Palladian-style window that had been first seen on buildings in the 1500s in Italy, with an architect whose last name is Mr. Palladio. So we call them Palladian windows, and this gives you a sense of architecture is art that keeps repeating itself over and over again through the centuries. You have 2,000 years of details that you can pick from. And this Palladian-style window in the Malone home is something that has been on architecture for many centuries. Now, 2 doors to the left of the Malone home is this house. Can you see the drawing? I know it's an architect-designed house. And these are the architectural plans for 26 Maple Street. And all of these architectural drawings are at the Rush Rees Library at the River Campus of the University of Rochester. How do I know that? Because a colleague of mine, Ann Parks, we were the ones that brought these thousands and thousands and thousands of sheets of drawings out of the Dreyer, Harwood and Otis Dryer's residence, and got them up to the U of R instead of putting them in a dumpster. The signature on the far bottom right says J. Fay and Otis Dryer, an architecture firm that opened in 1888 and went for 100 years, and they kept all of their drawings, all of their records, all of their letters, and we got them all up at the University of Rochester, and you can go see them. When I did the Victor inventory, I had seen that the Fay and Dryers, I knew they had designed buildings in Victor, and I hit the jackpot because architects only put street names on their drawings. They don't put house numbers, so it just says Victor, and in this case, it doesn't even say Maple Avenue. I had to do some snooping. So this is the house at 26 Maple Avenue before the additions and modern siding have been put on it. This is the design for the front, but the drawings that are at the University of Rochester also include all the floor plans and a drawing for each of the other sides. So if the people that live there, they could get copies of these and frame them for their wall, or you could get copies for your archives. This is one of the Fay and Dryer designed 1903-06 houses. The other is a farmhouse that looks very similar. And here it is. This is, you turn south on Maple Avenue and you head toward Holcomb, all right? I think you're past the apple farm that burned. It's on the left. This is the house. It's got that split rail fence in the front, but see the front where the gable goes up? You've got that round arched window. It's very similar to 26 Maple Avenue. But this is the other Fay and Dryer designed house in Victor, and their plans, like the one I just showed you, this is similar to the house at 26 Maple Avenue, but I was really excited when I hunted this down, because again, I didn't have addresses. I just had the name of the original owner. So this is out on Route, whatever that route. Okay, this is on the east side. And it is an architect-designed farmhouse, and my guess is that family had some disposable income or a couple of years of great crops in 1903, and they said, we're going to get a modern house instead of our old-fashioned farmhouse, and they hired an architect. That's really important to understand, because everybody thinks architects, they work in New York City, they work in Boston, they just work in big places. Architects do something really well. They like to get paid. They will go anywhere that somebody will pay them to travel. And in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s, they didn't need a car. They jumped on the train in downtown Rochester. We had 6 railroad depots in downtown Rochester. Pick a destination, you could get there. The same firm, the Dryers, they designed 7 buildings in South Lima, New York. Do you even know where South Lima, New York is? You would, because it's Pack Paddle Ski. The Dryers had a summer place in South Lima, and there's a whole pile of architect-designed buildings in South Lima, a hamlet that's about this big. They designed buildings in the Adirondacks. You got on a train in downtown Rochester, and you went to the Adirondacks. Somebody would pay you to do this. It could be a church congregation. It could be somebody who wanted a second house or a first house. So you can never say, oh, we don't have any architect-designed buildings. We're just a little agricultural farm community. All you needed is somebody who wanted one, and the architect would hop on probably the Rochester and Eastern. That went 60 miles an hour. You could get from downtown Rochester out to Victor in 47 minutes. That's better than in a car. So you have to realize that architects, as early as the 1870s and 80s, would travel anywhere they'd got paid to do a project. Do any of you know Phelps, New York? Downtown Phelps, 96 goes right through Phelps, because I was there the other day. All right, you're in Phelps. Downtown Phelps has got great commercial buildings. It's got one of the great ensembles of just gorgeous architecture. Go park and walk around. But as you're leaving downtown Phelps and you get back to where it's all these houses, on the left, about 5 or 6 houses down, all of a sudden there's this house that doesn't look like it should be there. It's wide, and the walls are angled, and they're stucco, and it almost looks kind of Mediterranean. It's got a tile roof. Welcome to a 1910s house by Arthur Headley, architect out of Rochester, New York. Somebody in Phelps hired him to come out and build a modern house for them right on Main Street. It's got, I think, a metal fence in front of it, but it doesn't look like the rest of Phelps' houses. That's because Mr. Headley, that was his trademark style. There's a whole bunch of houses like that on Rochester's East Avenue, not far from Wegmans. So I want to make the point is, don't underestimate your local agricultural residents from 100 years ago. They might have hired an architect to design a house for them, not just in town, but out at the family farm. And that's a big surprise to many people. Now, not all architects left records, and this is what drives my colleagues and I crazy. This is a beautiful house on Main Street, very sophisticated. It has some colonial-style round columns. It's got that beautiful bay window on the left, those really nifty dormers on the top. This screams architect design, but we don't have any records, so we don't know if it is, but it's very suspicious. Remodeling. The house we're about to look at is your super-duper remodeling job from about 1910. But it's all historic today. We would never change it. You all know this house. It's on West Main Street. But that said it started as a federal-style house. Well, maybe it did, but you can't quite see it anymore. This is a family or owners that had money at certain points of time. We always know if you have money or if it's a good year, remodeling is about to happen. This house, where is the first shot? We need the first. There we go. Okay, the back end of this house might be before the Civil War, but the front part with that big square boxy shape and that cupola on the top, that's remodeling number 1. Welcome to our big fancy Italianate house somewhere in the 1870s or 80s. Somebody expanded the original house to look really impressive, and that's got the finial on the top of the cupola. Then about 1900-something or other, there was another infusion of money, and they decided, how about a nice colonial wraparound porch? So the porch was added with that beautiful stone construction, those lovely columns, the balustrade at the top, which you can see up close. This is remodeling number 2, big porch so you could sit outside in the summer, spy on your neighbors, but hope there's a nice breeze to keep you cool. And this is likely an architect-designed porch because it's got cut stone and really sophisticated details. As you can see here, this is the bottom of the porch, this beautiful iron grill and those gorgeous natural stones. Those are not concrete. And there's the view. There is a porch that's really like a living room. See how wide that is? You dragged out the living room furniture, I'm serious, and this is where you sat in the hot weather and hope to get cooled off. So this is a really interesting house that had 3 eras of construction, Federal to Italianate and then Colonial Revival with the big porch. And those are all now part of the history of the house. We would never change any of them. And there's the interior, this is the interior of that house. They not only put the porch on, the entire interior of the house is all Colonial Revival. That arch looks Greek Revival and Federal. So what's going on here? Well, there was a big fair in 1876. It was the first World's Fair, and it was in Philadelphia. It was called the United States Centennial. We were 100 years old in 1876, and something really unusual happened at the fair. They featured American architecture, and architects and people started to go, look at those interesting houses from 1780 that they built in Massachusetts. Look at those really quite elegant houses they built in 1790 in Virginia and Louisiana and New Jersey. We started looking at our own colonial era architecture and appreciating it. We weren't still looking to Europe for ideas. And we have not gotten rid of the colonial revival ever since. For the last 140 years, we have been copying American colonial era design, whether it was built in 1890 or 2022. We just can't get rid of colonial revival. And in this house on West Main Street, there's nothing about that front hall that's Italianate. Whoever was there and put the front porch on also had the entire interior updated to colonial revival in like 1907. And it's beautiful. We wouldn't undo it today, but it shows that American behavior. They say clothing styles change, but human behavior does not, and people love to remodel their homes. So here's a remodeling, a real top-to-bottom remodeling from about 1907. I wanted to show a couple of your surviving transportation buildings that are wonderful in their own right. The depot with its beautiful brackets out on Maple Avenue, which was originally called Railroad Street. The Rochester and Eastern Trolley Station on Maple Avenue, which the trolley ran from 1903 to 1930, and then there were too many cars and they stopped going in business. Now, I talked to Eileen Malone, the harpist. She was born in 1906, and she told me she loved the interurban trolley. She could jump on that. It was across from her house, just up the street from her house. Eileen could jump on that and get to downtown Rochester to take her harp lessons in no time at all. And then the trolley was out of business by 1930, and she had to figure out car transportation. So the trolley was really a wonderful, and women would go shopping into Sibley's downtown, and then they'd come home to Victor. The trolley was an amazing thing, and it didn't putter along at 30 miles an hour. Those babies went 60 to 70 miles an hour on those tracks. They were really humming along, and it beats the traffic on the expressway any day. So this is your interurban trolley, a different kind of transportation, and it was electric driven. And then cars came in. I like looking at old garages. I'm always thrilled when I find some historic pre-1940s garages, and you have a number of those here still in the community. This is on East Main Street. Oops. And then you have the historic water pump station, which has been beautifully restored, and is another part of a very interesting history, you getting modern water service here in the village very early in the 20th century. American four-square design comes in the early 20th century. This is called the most amount of house built for the least amount of money. Do any of you live in a house that looks like that? It basically looks like a box, and it's got a hipped roof, 4 different slopes, and often dormers, sometimes usually 4 bedrooms. You have a living room, a dining room, a kitchen with a pantry, and a big porch. And these were built by the thousands. And these came actually out of the Midwest. Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, these architects in the Midwest were looking to do something different for American housing design. And this is called American Four-Square. 4 sides, it's square. This is a title that was just invented about 30 years ago. We did not have Greek Revival and Italianate. We just called these houses early 20th century vernacular for a long time. But these were built by the thousands. They're a great practical layout, And they were a phenomena for about 20 years, from about 1900, 1910 to about the 1930s, and then they were out of style. Other styles that came in, this is a arts and crafts influence style that wants you to think it's kind of handcrafted, but sometimes these even came in kits. You had an entire house as a kit. Do you have any kit houses that you're aware of? But I mean, so you do know of some that are in town. The kit houses were a brilliant marketing idea. Where was the most lumber in the United States in the early 20th century? Northern Michigan. Huge lumber. And all those railroad tracks that went everywhere in North America. The lumber companies figured if they put together all the pieces of lumber for a house, for the building, for the floors, for the interior, the woodwork, everything, they literally could sell you a kit that would arrive in a railroad boxcar in your community. I know of 3 of them in the village of Honey Eye Falls, that they literally came as these big kits, and you had your local, again, we'll put Chauncey back to work. Chauncey would be hired, and he'd come over, and all this, he'd get the drawings, and these pieces of wood were numbered, so you could build the whole house, hardware, windows, the whole shebang. And there were 6 companies. The Sears Roebuck Company, the Aladdin Company, and 3 others. They were all based in Michigan. And it was these Michigan lumber barons that were creating these kits. You could get a kit for a garage if you wanted to add a garage to your home. You could get a kit that was a house. Now, I'm not saying this is a kit house, but they were sometimes like this. But I've seen a kit house that had 12 rooms in it. They were big houses. You could get a kit that was a chicken coop. And again, it could come right down here to the Victor Railroad Depot, and you'd have this kit, and you just put it together, and you had your fruit stand or your garage or an entire house. And there's one company still in business that does kit houses, and it's the Aladdin Company. And this was done roughly from about the 1910s to the 1940s. But they're fabulous. It's a whole really hidden history of American housing construction. Colonial revival that you're used to is taking these design features from American houses from the 1780s, the 1790s, the early 1800s, and now you're going to see houses in the 1910s and 20s. This is up on Church Street, a center entrance house, and there are little windows on either side like we saw with the federal style, but this has electricity. They don't have to worry about getting natural light in. But you're picking and choosing a lot of design details from American house styles from 100, 140 years earlier. And so these colonial revival houses, they have electricity, they have plumbing, they have modern heating, but they're hearkening back to these earlier colonial styles of the East Coast. Here's yet another version. We have those lovely dormers. This might be an architect design house because those dormers are pretty sophisticated, particularly those windows that you're looking at. Another version of what we call center entrance colonial revival. These are all houses from anywhere from the 1920s to the 1940s. The Catholic Church was built in the 1920s, and they used Gothic revival. Those pointed arched windows were part of there. That is your most recent church construction in the village. And the only example of this design, which goes back to King Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, this is Tudor, T-U-D-O-R, the Tudor family. This is the wing of the Catholic Church. There's no other building in town in this 20th century Tudor revival style, which has white plaster separated by brown wood, and we call it half timbering, because this looks like something from a medieval building. It's supposed to, but it's very modern construction technique. But this is the only example that you have in all of Victor. I wanted to show you one of these, and we're almost done. One of these markers. In the 1930s, the state of New York's education department decided it was time that there should be information markers placed all over New York State to inform state residents about the history of their communities. This is one of them. So when you drive around and you see this big cast iron marker, usually blue and yellow, the state colors, and it says State of New York Education Department. It's from this huge program during the Depression of putting these state markers all over New York State. Now, there are some modern programs that are doing that now, the Pomeroy Foundation, and I think you have a Pomeroy marker or two, that the Pomeroy Foundation is now paying for this type of marker. One of your most sophisticated houses was sacrificed on the altar of education. The beautiful Hillcrest house on High Street was purchased and removed so that you could have the modern high school in its place. I've suspected when I've seen pictures of Hillcrest that that is another architect-designed house, but we won't talk about its demise. But here you see the front door of your 1941 school. Oh my gosh, they've got pilasters. Look at those two-story flat columns that are attached to the building. We saw those back on the Greek Revival houses of the 1830s. So this gives you an idea of architecture is just one big rerun. You just take anything, the architects have 2,000 years of details to play with. Here's a 1941 school building that's got pilasters that go back to ancient Greece and a doorway with, that top is called a split entablature because it does this in the middle. That's right out of the American colonial designs of the 1780s and 90s. I don't know who your architect was for the school, but there definitely was one. And then we have the last examples of a really compact house design. The Cape Cod design. I'm seeing a lot, any Cape Codders here in the audience? You must know this house though. It's up on, this is a really different Cape Cod in that it's got a lot of details you're not expecting. Those two dormers on the front, it's got that pretty bay window on the side, and I'm wondering if this is from a design book, because it's not just a contractor's house. But this is a very specific kind of house from the 1930s and 40s. And it's leading into this depression in the 1930s cut off a lot of construction, obviously. And in the 1940s, we had World War II, and you couldn't get building materials. They were a sort of war effort. So it wasn't until after World War II that you start to get an uptick in construction again with houses. And one of your locals who came back to this community, I think he was in his 80s, he laid out a little enclave of houses up off of Andrew Street, and he named the streets after American cigarette companies. There's Kent Street, what are the other ones? Salem, Tarryton, which I'd never seen. I mean, I've seen, a lot of street names are usually British because that sells the product. Even today, you wanted to call it Sandringham Drive or Buckingham Lane. We threw the King of England out in the 1700s, but we use the English as a marketing tool even today. But I had never seen a neighborhood named after tobacco products. But this is now after World War II, and we're starting to get a different kind of house and a bigger lot. So the houses are going to start to stretch in length. Now this one is a Cape Cod. It's not terribly, but look at it, it's got the attached garage. They're no longer worrying about your car exploding and burning the house down. Then when you hit a separate garage. And you get the ranch house, based on literally ranch houses from California, but look how long this house is. This is showing that the building plot, the lots are getting bigger, and energy is cheap. Oil wasn't real expensive, so people were building these bigger houses. They weren't thinking, oh gosh, my electricity and fuel bill is going to be high. That's why you start to get, I've seen some ranch houses that are immensely long, and they have nothing to do with conserving energy because it's from the 1950s. So these ranch houses are often, these are very different from anything we've seen in North America before the late 1940s. And the house has the garage that's attached. you still have people adapting. This is when George Baker takes a commercial or an agricultural building and makes it a house. Oops. The Chamber of Commerce, though, these are new buildings. We're still copying from the old. These are very recent, but these are styles from the 19th century. And you have modern designs that defy history and architecture, yet these are now the kind of houses that are becoming historic when they hit their 50th birthday. So you've been very patient and let me talk a long time. Here are some of the things here in Victor that are really wonderful. They're exciting, and go out and drive and see them because you've got all this history in your backyard. Thank you. Any questions?
Before you get questions or before you need to leave, on the back table is walking tour of the village and a driving tour of the town. So if you, on the back table is a walking tour of the village and a driving tour of the town. So take them, they're free. It's boring in the winter, go out for a drive or go for a nice walk and you'll see what Cynthia has. I mean, I learned a lot, and I should know a lot of this, but it was really, really very, very in-depth knowledge she has.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, you talk about this has an architect. Well, these houses in the 1800s, they didn't just come up like mushrooms out of nowhere.
Pardon?
Before architects, I mean, there must have been architects. Somebody knew how to build a house and design it. So what did they do?
That's a whole semester discussion. You're absolutely correct, and I left out a lot of this book. Obviously, human beings have sought shelter for thousands and thousands of years, morphing from, I'll call it, the cave, where you literally, to obviously in hotter climates, adapting the material, a little roof. And typically, if you look at, you are correct about architects. The first architects' school in America was at MIT in the 1870s. Before that, architects went to Europe to get training. Or here in this country, somebody who knew how to put a design together, 4 walls, you would intern with them. You'd study with, and they had interned with somebody else going back and back. So when I'm looking, when I'm showing you, I'm not showing you the log cabin that it was here and was obviously something that they knew log cabins in New England. The New England, mostly you were settled by New Englanders. You didn't have many people coming up from like Virginia or Georgia. You had people from cold climates, and they knew what was available in New England because the settlers from England had brought that with them when they came in the 1600s. So there was the tradition of building things, certainly came from Europe. But there was already a building tradition here that was very practical, and that was the Native Americans. The longhouse was one of the most practical and thrilling. When they built the longhouse as a child of the 60s, I had seen drawings of a longhouse, and I saw the exhibit at the Museum and Science Center, but it was a thrill to walk into the longhouse reproduction up at Ganondagan. So think of all of the Native American tribes in North America who were very in tune with their climate and the materials they had for building. Obviously, the Native Americans in this part of the country used wood that was in the forest. But if you go out to New Mexico and see the Hopi and the Navajo, they have the mud-built pueblos. So morphing from that kind of, I'd call it vernacular or common four walls and some sort of a roof, to architect-designed buildings. We know we had architects with Rome and Greece, but they didn't go to a university. They obviously, through practice, and I go back to the Romans when I talk about these round arches, that was a colossal engineering invention because it was more, it had more strength than just, the Greeks only knew that. 2 posts and a piece of wood across the top. That was it. They had no idea about an arch. And I'm not an engineer. I don't know if there's any engineers in the, I'm out of my depth. So as trained architects in America, I know that we had them by the end of the 1700s, people like Benjamin Latrobe, who did a lot of the first buildings in Washington, D.C., but they had interned with somebody who was already in the, the knowledge was passed from master to apprentice, since going back before the Middle Ages.
So if I moved to Victor in 1820 with my family, I probably got a garden or cows and everything. Okay, my wife and I are here, I have to have a house. You're saying they didn't have an architect.
They had builders, master builders. My great-great-grandfather, on my dad's side, my great-great-grandfather's name was Calvin Wooster Owen. He lived from 1798 to 1883. And he and his dad came from over near Saratoga when the War of 1812 had just, everybody heard that the British had burned Buffalo, and there was a lot of work for carpenters. So my great-great-grandfather and his dad came from Ballston Spa all the way to Canandaigua, and we've got his diary. That's the book that I gave to you. And they got to Canandaigua, and they paused in Canandaigua, which was a big, sophisticated center of the universe, and they found out there were too many carpenters in Buffalo rebuilding after the British had burned it. So he stayed here for the rest of his life, and he became a carpenter joiner. And we have his ledger of all the projects he did in Penfield, Canandaigua, I don't know about Victor, because he had learned the craft of, 4 walls and a roof and some other more sophisticated things, because he did eventually build things. But he didn't go to a school, and I don't think he read any book about how to do this. He was trained by his father. The skills were passed down, and he obviously knew from living in the Hudson Valley the kind of buildings that were over there, and the technology, it was all hand tools. So it wasn't really till the, in the Industrial Revolution where you could even, how many of you know about lumber? You've heard of something called like a 2x4? My mother did carpentry. She was a nurse, but I grew up in the lumber yards. I thought every mother took their kid to the lumber yards. There was no dimensional lumber till recent decades. 2x4s aren't even 2 inches by 4 inches anymore, if any of you know that drill. But when we were looking at some of the earliest houses here in Victor or anywhere else, there was no standard of measurement. When you took a tree down, you've got this lady in the purple, you've got logs in your basement, right? You wanted to build quickly, so, for the basement, sometimes they just took the big tree, sliced it in half, and slid it in there, and they kept the log, because it was a lot less labor-intensive than when you had your little axe, and you were doing this, and you were making it into a square. But again, it was skills that were passed from master to apprentice.
I'm going to invite anybody else with questions to come up and talk with Cynthia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. This is wonderful.